Hello and welcome to Wednesday in Parliament, our look at the best of the day in the Commons and the Lords. On this programme, the bill that triggers the UK's EU departure process finally clears the Commons and heads for the Lords.
The ayes to the right, 494. The noes to the left, 122.
As a local authority abandons a large council tax rise to pay for social care, the Labour leader presses Theresa May on whether a deal was done.
And is the same sweetheart deal on offer to every council facing the social care crisis created by her government?
The last thing social care providers need is another one of Labour's bouncing cheques.
And crisis? What crisis? A minister in the House of Lords calms fears about those absent vegetables in the supermarkets.
The only shortage will be of iceberg lettuce, which we think will be for about a few months, and there is a wonderful variety called Kos, which is even better.
But first, the bill that authorises ministers to trigger Article 50, the process by which the UK starts its departure from the European Union, has cleared the House of Commons. The EU notification of withdrawal bill will now move on to the House of Lords, where it will undergo more detailed discussion. Before the bill's final day of debate in the Commons, the Brexit process was brought up at Prime Minister's Question Time by the SNP's Westminster leader. Angus Robertson focused on the decision of the Scottish Parliament to reject the triggering of Article 50.
When the Prime Minister was in Edinburgh on the 15th of July last year, she pledged that she would, and I quote, not trigger Article 50 until she had an agreed UK-wide approach.
Wow. Correct.
So given that the Scottish Parliament has voted overwhelmingly against her approach, and all bar one MP representing a Scottish constituency in this House of Commons has voted against her approach, she does not have an agreed UK-wide approach. Now, Mr. Speaker, as the Prime Minister knows, a lot of people in Scotland watch Prime Minister's questions. So will she tell those viewers in Scotland whether she intends to keep her word to Scotland or not?
The Supreme Court was very clear that the Scottish Parliament does not have a veto on the triggering of Article 50. The bill that is going through the House, obviously, is giving the power to the government to trigger Article 50. And I would also remind him of this point, because he constantly refers to the interests of Scotland inside the European Union. An independent Scotland would not be in the European Union.
Then came a reference to Kenneth Clarke's speech in the Commons last week.
The Prime Minister's right honourable friend, the member for Rushcliffe, last week pointed out that her aspiration to achieve barrier-free, tariff-free trade with the single market, getting all the benefits but paying none of the costs, was actually akin to disappearing down the rabbit hole to Wonderland. Mr. Speaker, I think she makes a very interesting choice for Alice. But if she doesn't manage to achieve that high ambition, would she produce an analysis of what trading on WTO rules would actually mean for our economy so we can make a proper choice?
We believe it is possible within the two-year time frame to get the agreement not just for our withdrawal from the European Union, but also the trade arrangements that will ensure that we have a strong strategic partnership with the European Union in the future.
Shortly after PMQs, the Commons moved on to more discussion on the details of the EU notification of withdrawal bill, better known as the Brexit bill. The co-leader of the Greens, Caroline Lucas, seized on the fact that Theresa May has not expressed any guarantees so far about the rights of EU nationals living and working in the UK.
What we're talking about here are people's lives. People's lives are not simply commodities to be traded at the convenience of some wider bargain. The Prime Minister quite simply could and should guarantee to people who've made their lives here in good faith that, of course, they can stay here in the future. The idea that it is appropriate to do otherwise, I think, is quite honestly completely out of
the
order.
lady give way on that point. Is she aware, as I am, of EU nationals in very senior positions in the UK, in UK institutions, who are already leaving the country, and people who are EU nationals who are being interviewed for senior positions who are now asking very searching questions about what does Brexit mean for them and their families in the future.
I want to make sure that this issue is put into perspective. Out of the 3.5 million EU nationals currently residing in the UK, approximately 64% of them already have the right to stay here. 8% of them are children of an EU national parent, and therefore they have a right to reside here. And 12% of the 3.5 million people will have accrued their 5 years permanent residency by 2018.
Let's be practical. We can't even deport convicted criminals. The truth is that not a single EU national is ever going to be deported.
I agree wholeheartedly with that, and that would be against any ideas of natural justice, legitimate expectation, and the rule of law if we were to be going down that course of action.
I do think that on this particular issue around EU nationals, the Prime Minister could lead her MPs through the lobbies today and vote to guarantee those rights for EU nationals working here. She could make clear, as have others said, that they will not be used as a bargaining chip, and we could end their uncertainty today. Likewise, we will also want to safeguard the rights for Brits living in Europe too. But I believe by adopting a positive approach today, we make it more likely Brits living in the EU will be treated fairly.
The issue of EU nationals was once again raised this afternoon. It has been debated also earlier this week. I want to once again state to the House that the government fully recognises that the issue of EU nationals resident in the United Kingdom is an extremely important one, and one which we wish to address as a matter of priority, just as we wish to address the issue of the rights of UK nationals resident in the EU. No, I won't. This, however, has got to be a matter that is addressed after the negotiations commence.
And after the detailed committee stage of the bill was finished, the legislation entered what's known as its third reading stage. And when a final vote of the House took place, the government won through.
The ayes to the right, 494. The noes to the left, 122.
The ayes to the right, 494. The noes to the left, 122. The ayes have it. The ayes have it.
Claims that the government agreed a behind-the-scenes deal with a Conservative-controlled council over the funding of social care have been made by the Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn. Surrey County Council was due to hold a referendum of its residents to gain approval for a 15% rise in council tax to pay for the costs of care in Surrey for elderly and vulnerable people. The vote was called off, and the 15% rise was withdrawn. A much smaller increase will be made instead. At Prime Minister's questions, Jeremy Corbyn said the problems of paying for social care across the country had become a crisis.
The crisis is so bad that until yesterday, Mr. Speaker, David Hodge, the Conservative leader of Surrey County Council, planned to hold a referendum for a 15% increase in council tax. And at the last minute, it was called off. Can the Prime Minister tell the House whether or not a special deal was done for Surrey?
I recognise the short-term pressures. That's why we have enabled local authorities to put more money into social care. We have provided more money. Over the next 2 years, 900 million more pounds will be available for social care.
Mr. Speaker, my question was whether there had been a special deal done for Surrey. The leader said they'd had many conversations with the government. We know they have, because I've been leaked copies of texts sent by the Tory leader David Hodge, intended for somebody called Nick, who works for ministers in the Department of Communities and Local Government. And these texts read, "I'm advised that DCLG officials have been working on a solution and you will be contacting me to agree a memorandum of understanding. Will the government now publish this memorandum of understanding?
What the Labour Party fails to understand is that this is not just a question of looking at money. It is a question of looking at spreading best practice and finding a sustainable solution. And I have to say to him that if we look at social care provision across the entire country, the last thing social care providers need is another one of Labour's bouncing cheques.
Mr. Speaker, I wonder if it's anything to do with the fact that the Chancellor and Health Secretary both represent Surrey constituencies. But, Mr. Speaker, there was a second text from Surrey County Council leader to Nick, and in the second text, it says the numbers you indicated are the numbers that I understand are acceptable for me to accept and call off the R. Now, I've been reading a bit of John le Carre, and apparently R means referendum. It's very subtle, all this. And he goes on to say in his text to Nick, if it is possible for that info to be sent to myself, I can then revert back soonest. Really want to kill this off. So, how much did the government offer Surrey to kill this off? And is the same sweetheart deal on offer to every council facing the social care crisis created by her government?
Yet again, what we get from Labour are alternative facts. What they really need is an alternative leader. What he always fails to recognise is that you can only spend money on social care and on the National Health Service if you have a strong economy to deliver the wealth that you need.
A Labour MP has recently returned to the Commons after undergoing hospital treatment for cancer.
And it's been absolutely wonderful, the service I got. But there is a flip side, and the flip side is what we're seeing today. And now we have dedicated nurses, who call them corridor nurses, and they're in the corridor, and they're looking after patients on trolleys. I'm quite honest, Prime Minister, that's not the way we want our health service to run. We want it the way to run what saved me. Get your purse open and give them the money that they want.
Well, as the Speaker said, I welcome the honourable gentleman to his place again in this chamber. And I commend all those, the surgeon and all those who have treated him in the National Health Service that has enabled him to be here today and to continue his duties. There are, as we know, surgeons, doctors, nurses, other staff up and down the NHS, day in and day out, saving lives, and we should commend them for all that they do. The North East actually is a very good example of some of the really good practice that we see in the National Health Service. What I want to see is that good practice being spread across the NHS, across the whole country.
And it's official. As we long suspected, the Prime Minister is a keen viewer of BBC Parliament. During Prime Minister's questions, she told MPs how often she tunes in during the course of an evening. It all stemmed from a question put to Theresa May by an SNP MP about long-winded speeches.
Does the Prime Minister agree that in a 21st century Parliament, the rules should not enable any member to speak for 58 minutes in a 3-hour debate? Does she agree with me that the rules of the House should be changed to prevent filibustering and to ensure that members from all sides of the House get a fair share of the time available?
I have to say, I find that a rather curious question from the honourable gentleman. Last night, as it happens, I was out of the House between the two votes. I switched on the BBC Parliamentary channel and I saw the honourable gentleman speaking. I turned over to something else. I switched back. I switched back to the Parliamentary channel. I saw the honourable gentleman still speaking. I switched over to something else. I switched back back and the honourable gentleman was still speaking. He's the last person to complain about filibustering in this House.
Theresa May, you're watching our roundup of the day in the Commons and the Lords. Still to come, as overseas veg becomes more scarce in the supermarkets, an appeal for shoppers to buy British. The government has faced demands for a limit on the amount that high street banks can charge customers who have an unarranged overdraft. The calls follow an investigation by the consumer body which into what it's called the punitive charges. It found the cost to borrowers of an unauthorised overdraft was even higher than the cost charged by a payday lender. In a debate in Westminster Hall, MPs joined Which in urging the government and the watchdog, the Financial Conduct Authority, to take action.
The major banks currently make over £1 billion per year on charges on unauthorised overdrafts, the majority of whom, says the head of the Competition and Markets Authority, from financially vulnerable customers. Step Change Debt Charity has estimated that there are 1.7 million people in the UK trapped in an overdraft cycle, consistently using overdrafts to meet essential and emergency costs. Research published today by Which found consumers needing as little as £100 could be charged up to £156 more by some major high street banks than the Financial Conduct Authority allows payday loan companies to charge when borrowing the same amount for the same period. So, as an example, they compared the cost of borrowing £100 for 30 days and found that unarranged overdraft charges at some high street banks were as much as 7.5 times higher than the maximum charge of £24 on a payday loan for the same period.
Sometimes it's in the bank's interest to allow customers to run massive overdrafts so they can push them on to even higher personal loans and other products which they might not need and might not be the right thing for them in their circumstances.
The government is committed to doing two things. Firstly, to making sure that we support and encourage competition amongst financial services providers, not only so people have more choice over who they bank with, but because we know more competition inevitably means better options on offer to customers who can vote with their feet. But secondly, we want to make sure that British customers are supported in the important financial decisions they make.
The FCA, he said, was already investigating high-cost credit, including overdrafts.
We will, I can reassure honourable members, the government will be monitoring closely the work of the FCA in looking at this area. And I'm sure, and I'll say it again, the views expressed by honourable members this morning will be taken into consideration as the regulator carries out its work. We will also be continuing our efforts as government, complementing that work of the FCA. We've taken steps to encourage competition. We've taken steps to support credit unions. We've taken steps to improve financial education. And it's through this comprehensive approach that this government will continue to take steps to make sure British customers have quality choices, good information and strong protections.
Voters are to be asked to produce a form of identification at polling stations under new plans being trialled by the government. It follows a review published last year into tackling electoral fraud. But at question time in the Commons, a Labour MP said a requirement for ID could lead to some people being denied their right to vote.
In December 2008, I was an election observer in Bangladesh, and because of previous voter fraud, they actually photographed 80 million people, and it was clearly identifiable when people went to vote the photograph. So has the government considered this? Because we need in a democracy as many people to vote as possible, but we don't want theft of identity when people vote.
My Right Honourable Fred makes a very good point around international comparisons. There are many countries across the world, including Canada, Brazil, Austria, that already have photographic ID when it comes to voting in polling stations, including in Northern Ireland that was introduced in 2003. The government is taking forward pilots at looking at electoral identification. This will take place in the local government elections of 2018, and we will be willing to test various forms of identification, photographic ID, non-photographic ID, above all to ensure that no one is disenfranchised when it comes to voting.
Nick Smith. Speaker, the government's talk of voter fraud is a smokescreen for voter suppression.
Just as in America.
Yeah, they're putting obstacles between people and the polling booth instead of working to boost our democracy. If it is such a problem, can the Minister report how many convictions there have been for voter fraud last year?
I'm surprised at the honourable gentleman for somehow claiming this is a smokescreen. It was a Labour government that introduced photographic ID in Northern Ireland in 2003. The Electoral Commission and all other Electoral Commission administrators have called for ID in polling stations.
Chris Skidmore. The case of Ched Evans, the Wales international footballer eventually found not guilty of rape, has thrown into the spotlight the issue of how far cross-examinations in courtrooms should go. In the Commons, a Plaid Cymru MP has said women are being unfairly subjected to humiliating questioning over their sexual history and even their choice of clothing. She was introducing a bill under Parliament's 10-minute rule that would limit the ability of barristers to bring in evidence about an accuser's sexual history in an assault trial.
The provisions in this bill are all based on the distressing experiences of victims of serious sexual crimes. Ivy, a rape victim, was told at a ground rules hearing that her sexual history would not be used. But in court she faced questions and allegations that she was promiscuous. There was no judicial intervention. Emma was followed by a stranger who attacked and tried to rape her. Her screams were met with the threat of stop or be killed. Fortunately, 2 off-duty police officers heard her screams. The trial fixated on why Emma chose to wear a red dress on that summer's evening. The humiliation of victims of sexual assault by reference to matters irrelevant to the case cannot be allowed to continue.
Well, the bill won the initial support of MPs, but it's not likely to become law without the support of the government. Now, it's probably not at the top of the Prime Minister's in-tray, but the shortage of items on the fruit and veg shelves of our supermarkets following recent bad weather in southern Europe has certainly led to plenty of concern. The absence of courgettes in particular prompted a flurry of comment on social media. Some reports have declared that Britain is in the grip of a courgette shortage that could last for months. So how serious is the situation? In the House of Lords, a minister was keen to calm our vegetable anxieties.
He will have seen the news reports of empty shelves in supermarkets, with the crisis expected to last until the spring. And meanwhile, prices have trebled, in part because it costs more to fly vegetables from the USA and from Egypt than it does to bring them overland from Spain. So can I ask, given the public health implications, is the department confident that there are sufficient alternative sources of vegetables, particularly in schools and hospitals? Can I also ask, is the department monitoring the prices to ensure that profiteering isn't taking place?
My Lords, my officials have been discussing these matters with retailers and Covent Garden, and in point of fact, the situation is improving. The climate conditions in Spain and the Mediterranean are enabling the situation to improve, but not only that, there are other sources of supply from the Americas which are coming in. But I would say that it is a time when we should be reflecting about using our own wonderful, nutritious British vegetables. And at the moment, all I can say is, in the last few years, food prices have fallen by 7.4%, and I think that may deal with some of what the noble Baroness may have been implying.
Not any rational man or woman think that to describe a shortage of lettuces in the supermarket as a crisis shows a lack of understanding of the meaning of the words in the English language.
My Lords, I was seeking to be courteous to the noble Baroness, but it is certainly no crisis. The only shortage will be of iceberg lettuce, which we think will be for about a few months, and there is a wonderful variety called Kos, which is even better.
My Lords, my Lords, my Lords, half the vegetables that we eat in this country are imported, including native crops like cauliflowers and onions. Isn't it time that the government's forthcoming green paper on food and farming seeks to tackle this decline in homegrown veg?
My Lords, I thoroughly endorse the wish that we all have to produce more homegrown. It's precisely going to be at the heart of the forthcoming green paper, but very much so. In fact, I was pleased only this morning to hear that cauliflowers from Cornwall are coming onto the market, so we have a great opportunity again to buy some British vegetables.
I think it's only fair we hear from the Greens on this particular subject.
My
My huge thanks to the Leader of the House. Back in 2008, at the request of the then Mayor of London, Ken Livingstone, I produced a report on how to make London more sustainable in its food supplies. And part of that was actually shortening supply chains. Would the Noble Lord Minister like me to forward a copy of my report for the government's use to contribute to the Green Paper?
I'm sure the paper, and I would like to see a copy, endorses the importance of having lower food miles, which means that they come from this country.
Lord Gardner with some marvellous advice. That's it for this programme, but do join me for our next Daily Roundup. Until then, from me, Keith McDougall, goodbye.